We'll continue our lesson in Chapter 11, Section 2.1, Church and Crown. Of course, you'll need to go to our Lodi website, lodiusd.org, Clever, and from Clever, Cengage Learning. And from Cengage Learning, log into our World History book, the National Geographic Learning. And from there, it should be in Unit 5, Chapter 11, Section 2.1, Church and Crown. The chapter's essential question is, how did Europe change during the Middle Ages? And of course, the objective of this lesson is explain that during the Middle Ages, the church controlled lives and challenged the authority of kings. So the Roman Catholic Church grew in power during the Middle Ages. Lesson 2.1 explains how the church challenged the authority of kings. They say in the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church dominated people's lives from cradle to grave. It is definitely the strongest unifying force in medieval Europe. The church baptized, married, pardoned, and buried everyone from serfs, peasants, to kings. The overseer of the church formed the clergy. The Pope led this group, which includes the bishops and priests. While the priest was in charge of a single church, a bishop oversaw a group of churches. Bishops exercised their authority from towering churches called cathedrals, the skyscrapers of their day. Not everyone is attracted to these fancy cathedrals. Some withdrew from medieval society to live in religious communities called monasteries. Here is an example of a cathedral in Paris, the Cathedral of Notre in the city of Paris. Here's a closer look to this impressive infrastructure that was built during the Middle Ages as a testimony of the power and influence of the Catholic Church during this time. April 15, 2019, that was last year, this magnificent building was almost completely destroyed by a fire. Let's take a look at what happened to the Cathedral of Notre Dame.
On April 15, 2019, firefighters charged into the Notre Dame Cathedral to quell a blazing fire. They took careful precautions while spraying down the 850-year-old Parisian monument, like using lower water pressure and avoiding stained glass vulnerable to shattering. They also followed a plan to save priceless relics and works of art. In the days following, firefighters gave way to a new team on the front line, restoration scientists from the Laboratory for Historical Monuments. These researchers were tasked with evaluating the condition of the damaged stone, mortar, and metal, and guiding engineers on the best way to restore the cathedral. Even as they try to reclaim what was lost, the lab researchers and others are also analyzing samples of wood and stone for clues to the cathedral's medieval past. Their first order of business, stabilizing the cathedral. The lead roof and the wooden timbers that supported it were mostly gone, and there were holes in the vaulted stone ceiling. That threatened a delicate balance of forces between the vaults, which push outward on the cathedral walls, and the flying buttresses, which provide an inward stabilizing force. In order to steady the structure, temporary wood supports were installed to prevent the buttresses from toppling the walls. To restore the balance of forces, researchers also need to understand how the stone in the walls and vault were altered by the fire. Most of Notre Dame was constructed with limestone, an iconic stone used all over Paris, including at the Louvre. At 800 degrees Celsius, limestone can turn to a soft white powder known as lime. Even before this point, at 300 degrees Celsius, fire can begin to reduce its strength. One way to estimate these changes is by looking at the color of the stone. Beige indicates a sturdy structure, while a red or black surface means the fire has damaged its internal structure. The high porosity of limestone presents another complication. As firefighters hosed down the cathedral, some stones gained almost a third of their weight in water, further changing the balance of forces between the vaults and walls. The laboratory researchers are also grappling with what happened to the lead roof. Parts of it reached the melting point of 300 degrees Celsius, dripping into the vaults and gutters. But some of the lead became airborne. Yellow smoke billowed from the cathedral as a result. The lead powder that settled after the fire is toxic to humans, making researchers take careful precautions when working in the cathedral. Before restoration even begins, much of the cathedral must be decontaminated, and the mangled scaffolding put in place for renovations prior to the fire must be removed. Meanwhile, the exposed interior and fallen fragments of the cathedral have provided new opportunities for research. One researcher is using stone samples collected from the cathedral to learn about the quarries they came from. Other materials, like the wood from the attic beams, tell the climatic history of the 12th and 13th century. The long and narrow shape of the beams also indicate that these 100-year-old trees were grown alongside many other trees, and maybe were even farmed with the intention of using the wood to build the cathedral. These finds provide glimpses into the detailed construction of Notre Dame. It took 182 years to complete, with signature pieces like the spire added well after in the 19th century. Centuries from now, this fire will be just another chapter in the story of Notre Dame. But the collaborative research to understand its past and the careful plans to reconstruct the cathedral will allow future generations to continue to be inspired by the iconic structure.
Now let's talk about the struggle for power between the crown and the church. If anything, the power and wealth of the church began increasing in the year 1000, in part because it received free land from the nobles, and at the same time, however, kings began to regain their former authority. The king's rise weakened the feudal structure, but it also led to power struggle between the kings and the church. Because of the formation of towns, people relied more on their skills instead of relying more on farming and raising livestock. That is the center of the feudal system, which is land. Kings became more powerful because of the taxes that they are collecting to people individually, but the feudal structure or the feudal system was weakened because the source of power, the center of power in a feudal system or a feudal society is the land. The struggle came to a head in 1075. The German king, Henry IV, was next in line to become the Holy Roman Emperor. Like Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, Henry ruled over a multi-ethnic group of territories in Central Europe, an empire that would continue until it is dissolved in 1806. So here's the scenario. Henry had appointed his own priests to become bishops, but Pope Gregory VII claimed that these were religious appointments and should be his decisions. In other words, the argument boiled down to whoever get to appoint priests and bishops among different churches in Europe. This is definitely important because remember, the church is the source of wealth, of power, and influence. So whoever gets to appoint their men in these institutions, therefore, will get this power, influence, and wealth. The conflict raged until Gregory shut Henry out of the church, excommunicating him, forcing the king to back down. So Henry knew that if he did not, he would lose his throne. In those days, no one would have anything to do with a king who had been banished from the church. Gregory, the Pope, got his way and lifted the ban. He then regained full control of the religious appointments of priests and bishops in the church. This proves that even though kings command armies, church officials are, in their own special way, are powerful to the point that they can intimidate and even influence the most powerful person in the kingdom, which is the king. Now let's go to the review and assess questions. For number 1, reading check. How did Christianity unify the people of medieval Europe? And number 2, analyze language use. What does the sentence, the church dominated people's lives from cradle to grave, mean? And number 3, draw conclusions. Why was the conflict between King Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII important? In other words, what was the point that was proven out of this conflict between the church and the crown? Now go ahead, go to our Google Classroom and open the Review and Assess, Chapter 11, Section 2, Political and Social Change. Of course, you will need to fill up the information, the last name, the first name, class period, and date. And don't forget the key vocabs to the right side, the title of the lesson, and of course, the answer to the Review and Assess questions. At least you need to finish section or lesson 2.1 for today.